You're standing in a field of wild grass roughly 14,000 years ago, somewhere in what's now northeastern Jordan. The air is dry, the sun brutal, and the plants surrounding you look like nothing worth eating. Thin, papery seeds clinging to brittle stalks, hard as pebbles, bitter. Bite into one raw and you'd crack a tooth before you got any nutrition out of it. There's no obvious reason to look at this plant and think food, and yet the people beside you are harvesting it anyway, cutting the seed heads with flint blades, packing them into animal skin bags, hauling them back to camp where someone is about to spend hours cracking, pounding, grinding, and burning these tiny, tasteless grains into something a human body can actually use. Not because it's easy, because it might be the hardest thing they do all week. And that exact sequence, the slow, brutal transformation of an inedible seed into something edible, is the quiet origin point of arguably the single most important food humans have ever invented. So how did we actually figure out bread? The answer turns out to be older than farming, older than pottery, older than civilization itself. And it might be the very reason civilization exists at all. Here's where most people get the story backwards, because almost everyone assumes the same sequence. We settled down, we planted crops, and only then did we figure out bread. That's the version most of us grew up learning. According to the last 2 decades of archaeological evidence, it's probably reversed. In 2018, archaeologist Amaya Aranzo-Tegui at the University of Kokin published a paper that rewrote the timeline entirely. Her team had been excavating a site called Shubega 1, a Natfian hunter-gatherer camp in the Black Desert of Jordan, between 2012 and 2015. Inside 2 stone-lined fireplaces, they found 24 charred food fragments. Under a scanning electron microscope, those fragments turned out to be bread. Flatbread, made from wild intum, barley, oats, and the ground tubers of an aquatic plant called clubrush, dated to roughly 14,400 years ago, 4,000 years before anyone on Earth planted a single deliberate seed. Hunter-gatherers with no farms, no fields, no permanent homes were making bread, and not by accident. The process demanded harvesting wild grain, dehubbing it, grinding it into flour on stone, mixing it with water, and baking the dough in the coals of a fire. At least 5 distinct steps, each requiring its own knowledge and tools. Nobody stumbles into that sequence by chance. That's a recipe, followed by people who, according to the old story, weren't supposed to know how to do any of it. And Shubega 1 isn't even the oldest evidence of flour. At a site called Ohalo 2, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel, archaeologist Ehud Weyer found a large flat grinding stone with starch residue from wild wheat, barley, and oats embedded in its surface, dated to roughly 23,000 years ago. That's the late Ice Age. Mammoths were still walking the earth, and someone on the edge of a lake was already grinding wild grain into flour. Whether they baked it, ate it as paste, or cooked it into porridge, they'd already cracked the critical first step, turning a hard, indigestible seed into something soft enough to eat. And the grinding goes back even further. A pestle grinder found at Groca Pagicci in southern Italy, dated to roughly 32,600 years ago, contained starch granules from wild oats that had actually been thermically pre-treated, heated before grinding. Similar tools from the same era have turned up in Italy, Russia, and the Czech Republic. 30,000 years ago, across a wide stretch of Ice Age Europe, humans were already processing wild grain. Here's why that matters for bread specifically. Every one of these early grain comprators was solving the exact same underlying problem. Raw grain is nearly useless to a human body. The seed is wrapped in a tough fiber husk, and the starch inside sits locked in a crystalline structure. Crystalline structure your gut can't efficiently break down. Eat raw grain and you get almost nothing out of it. You might as well chew wood. But crack the husk, grind the starch into fine powder, and apply heat, and something genuinely changes. Heat leltinizes the starch, unfolding that crystalline structure into a form your digestive system can actually absorb. The calories become real, accessible energy. Grinding and cooking grain isn't just food prep. It's a chemical hack, unlocking energy that was always trapped inside the seed, but that your body could never reach on its own. There's something about the human gut most people never think about. Compared to other great apes, our digestive tract is unusually small. A chimpanzee carries a much larger colon relative to its body size. We traded gut size for brain size, a genuinely terrible deal if you're relying on raw plants, since raw plants take forever to digest and yield limited calories in return. Cooking solved that problem for meat and tubans. Grain is different though. A seed is specifically evolved to survive an animal's digestive tract intact, so it can pass through and germinate somewhere else. That's the literal evolutionary purpose of the seed coat. Armor. Grinding cracks that armor. Heat breaks down the starch inside, and fermentation arriving later in the bread story goes even further, reducing anti-nutrients like phytic acid by 50 to 70%, suddenly making iron, zinc, and magnesium available to the body. Your gut never evolved to eat grain. Bread is the technology that made grain edible anyway. Some gut bacteria have even genetically adapted specifically to digest compounds found in bread and brewer's yeast. Your body has literally reshaped itself around this food. And bread is, quite simply, the most efficient delivery system anyone ever invented for that unlocked energy. Mix ground flour with water, form dough, press it onto a hot stone or into ashes, and within minutes you have a portable, stateable, calorie-dense food that weighs almost nothing and lasts for days. Compare that to raw meat, which rots, or fruit, which bruises, or tubers, which are bulky and heavy. Bread is lightweight fuel. And for a species that spent most of its distance walking from one food source to the next, lightweight fuel is survival. Which raises the question that's been quietly haunting archaeologists for the last decade. If bread came before farming, did bread actually cause farming? The traditional story says agriculture led to bread. The evidence increasingly points the other way. Making bread from wild grain is brutally labor-intensive. Finding it, harvesting it by hand, stalk by stack, hauling it back, dehusking every seed individually, grinding for hours, mixing and baking. Low yield, enormous effort. But the payoff, bread itself, is extraordinary. Dense, storable, portable energy, and there's growing evidence it functioned as a prestige food. Something served at feasts and rituals, rather than eaten on an ordinary Tuesday. Which is exactly where Göbekli Tepe re-enters the story, that massive ritual complex in southeastern Turkey, built by hunter-gatherers around 9500 BG, thousands of years before anyone in the region farmed, shows real evidence of large-scale cereal processing. Researchers believe enormous quantities of grain were hauled to feed the workers and worshippers gathering there. The theory, supported by lead excavator Klaus Smith, is that the need to produce enough grain for these communal gatherings led to the rise of complex societies. The appetite for a reliable supply of bread and beer at feasts created the exact social pressure that eventually pushed people toward deliberately planting seeds. Bread didn't follow farming. The hunger for bread may have driven farming into existence. Sit with that for a second. The entire agricultural revolution, the single most consequential turning point in human history, the root of cities, empires, writing, and the world you're living in right now, may have started because people wanted a more reliable supply of bread. The grains themselves look nothing like what grows on a farm today. Wild einchu has a brittle stem that shatters the instant its seeds ripens, scattering them across the ground. Great for the plant's own reproduction, terrible for a human trying to collect them. Genetic and archaeological evidence points to the Karagadaj Mountains in southeastern Turkey as the region where eintum was first domesticated from its wild ancestor, somewhere around 8500 to 8000 BC. What early farmers did, probably without fully understanding it, was quietly select for plants whose stems didn't shatter, picking the easier to harvest ones, replanting those seeds, and over generation turning a wild grass into a crop. Emmer wheat and barley followed the same path across a broader stretch of the fertile crossgrint. Every grain we use today descends from those early half-blind experiments. Then, the bread took a turn nobody saw coming. At some point, someone left their dough out too long, and instead of tossing it, baked it anyway. It puffed up. That's levated bread. And the best evidence suggests it was invented in ancient Egypt, likely by accident, when wild yeast spores drifting through the air settled on a batch of dough and started fermenting. The chemistry is straightforward. Flour contains two proteins, glutenin and gliadin, which unfold and bond into an elastic network called gluten once you add water and work the mixture. Gluten is stretchy, forming tiny pockets, and when yeast, specifically Saccharomyces cerevisiae, starts consuming the sugars in the dough and releasing carbon dioxide, those pockets trap the gas. The dough inflates. It rises. Baking kills the yeast, evaporates the alcohol, and locks the protein structure in place permanently, producing soft, airy bread, the kind people actually crave. The Egyptians didn't just stumble on this once, they mastered it completely. By the New Kingdom, roughly 1570 to 1070 BC, Egypt had cataloged nearly 40 distinct types of bread, flavored with dates, figs, coriander, and honey, baked in conical ceramic molds by the hundreds of thousands. Bread was so central to Egyptian life, it functioned as currency. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza were paid in rations of bread and beer, not coins, not gold. The pharaoh was, in a real sense, the kingdom's chief baker, and his legitimacy hinged on his ability to feed people. Here's a detail connecting bread and beer that surprises most people. They're essentially the same invention. Both start with grain, both require grinding, both require water and fermentation. In many ancient Egyptian workshops, bread and beer were produced side by side using the same raw materials. A common brewing method involved baking coarse loaves, crumbling them into water, and letting the mixture ferment, with the bread itself acting as the yeast starter for the beer, while foam skimmed off fermenting beer was used to leaven bread in return. One single circular system. Anthropologists still debate whether bread or beer came first, and whether the true incentive behind domesticating grain was calories or alcohol. The honest answer is probably both. Tangled together so tightly that asking which came first is a bit like asking which came first, the inhale or the exhale. In 2019, physicist Seamus Blackley, also, oddly, the co-creator of the Xbox, partnered with an archaeologist and a microbiologist on an experiment that sounds like science fiction. Extracting dormant yeast from 400 or 500-year-old Egyptian ceramic baking vessels, held at museums in Boston and Harvard, feeding the revived organisms ancient emmer wheat flour and baking with it. Blackley described the resulting loaf as having a rich, sour aroma and a sweetness like brown sugar. Whether the yeast was truly ancient or modern contamination is debated, but the experiment put a 4,500-year-old recipe back into modern hands. There's a physical cost to ancient bread history that most retellings leave out entirely. Grinding grain by hand on a simple saddle quair, a flat stone and a smaller hand stone, meant kneeling on the ground and pushing that hand stone back and forth across the grain for hour after hour. Bioarchaeological studies of women from early agricultural communities reveal exactly what this did to their bodies. At the site of Abu Hurhay in Syria, skeletal studies show signs of severe arthritis in the big toes from curling them forward while kneeling for hours, compressed vertebrae in the lower back, and arm bones so densely built up from repetitive grinding motion that they rival the bones of modern elite rowers.
The bread that fed early civilizations was ground overwhelmingly by women, and the evidence is written directly into their skeletons. Someone paid for every loaf with their body. That physical toll is exactly why the invention of the rotary quail mattered so much. Instead of pushing a stone back and forth, you spun it.
More efficient motion, finer flour, and labor that, while still hard, was measurably less destructive. The Romans pushed this further still. At the Bar-Buncombe complex in southern France built in the 2nd century AD, 16 overshot wheels powered a flour mill, producing an estimated 4.5 tons of flour a day. Water did the grinding. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, bread no longer required breaking a human body to produce. No more breaking human bodies. And the Romans treated bread as a genuine political instrument. The poet Juniel coined the phrase panem et circados, bread and circuses, describing how Roman leaders held on power by keeping the urban masses fed and entertained. Free grain distributions to Roman citizens began in 123 BC under Grecius and expanded across the centuries. At the height of the empire, roughly 200,000 Romans received free grain every month. The bakers who converted that grain into bread, the pastores, were organized into a heavily regulated guild. Roman bakers couldn't simply leave the profession, and the obligation passed down to their children. Bread was too important to leave to the free market. One Roman baker's ambition generally outlasted every emperor of the era. Marcus Aurelius Eurysaces, a freed former slave who made his fortune baking, was buried around 30 BC beneath a massive tomb near Rome's Porta Magna that still stands today, decorated with stone carvings depicting every stage of industrial bread production. And if you want to see what a Roman bakery actually like, go to Pompeii. When Vesuvius buried the city in 79 AD, it preserved more than 30 commercial bakeries in volcanic ash, complete with brick-arched ovens and donkey-turned stone mills, including a round loaf called panis quadras, pre-scored into 8 wedges, still sitting inside an oven 19 centuries later. Pompeii had a population roughly 11,000 and more than 30 bakeries, one baker for every 350 people, proportionally higher density than modern Manhattan. Bread wasn't a side dish in Roman life. It was the main course of an entire civilization. Bread really isn't one invention, it's dozens. Nearly every culture on Earth independently looked at whatever starchy plant grew nearby and worked out how to grind it, mix it with water, and cook it flat. Corn tortillas in Mesoamerica, indela from teff in Ethiopia, naan and chapati from wheat in South Asia, pita across the Middle East, lava through the Caucasus, aretas from mesa in South America, roti across a dozen countries. None of these cultures were ever in contact when they independently developed their own flat breads. They arrived at the same solution separately because the underlying problem is universal. A starchy plant your body can't digest raw, solved by grinding it, adding water, and applying heat. The physics and biology are identical everywhere on the planet. Bread is a convergent invention, the same way eyes evolved independently across dozens of unrighted evolutionary lines. Wherever humans and grain coexist, bread eventually follows. Even language remembers this. The English word companion comes from the Latin com, meaning with, and panis, meaning bread. A companion is literally someone you share bread with. Lord descends from Old English lafweeder, meaning loaf guardian, the person who protects and distributes the bread. Lady comes from lafdigi, loaf kneader, the person who makes it. Every time an English speaker says lord or lady, they're using words that are, at their root, entirely about bread. Bread reshaped religion too. In Judaism, matzah, unleavened flatbread, marks Passover as a reminder of a hasty departure from Egypt, bread baked without time to rise. Challah represents the double portion of manna that sustained the Israelites. In Christianity, bread became the body of Christ in the Eucharist, the faith's most sacred ritual, and Jesus called himself the bread of life. In Islam, bread is treated with such reverence that dropping on the ground is followed immediately by picking it up and kissing it. In all of these traditions, bread isn't just food, it's the symbol through which the sacred enters ordinary life. Bread has toppled governments too. In 18th century, workers spent up to 88% of their wages on bread alone. When harvests failed in 1788 and 1789 and prices spiked, the result wasn't a policy debate, it was revolution. The Women's March on Versailles in October 1789 was driven in large part by the price of bread. The king was referred to as the first baker of the kingdom, and when he couldn't feed his people, his legitimacy to rule collapsed with the price of a loaf. The famous phrase attributed to Marie Antoinette, "let them eat cake," almost certainly wasn't hers at all, tracing instead to Rousseau's Confessions, written while she was still a child. But the fact that the myth survived and stuck to her anyway says everything about how completely bread was fused to political legitimacy. When people can't afford bread, they overthrow whoever they hold responsible. There's one more thread tying bread directly to the foundation of civilization: writing itself. The first writing system in human history, Sumerian Kunmenflik, wasn't developed to record poetry or mythology. It was developed to count grain. Around 8000 BC, administrators in Mesopotamia began using small clay tokens shaped to represent specific quantities of barley. Over centuries, those tokens got pressed into wet clay tablets, leaving impressions that gradually evolved into abstract wedge-shaped marks. Quintuplik, the invention that separates prehistory from recorded history, exists because someone needed to track how much grain had been collected, stored, and redistributed. The written word was born in a grain warehouse, and grain meant bread. In medieval Europe, bread became a marker of class. Nobility ate fine white manch loaves made from finely sifted flour. The poor ate coarse bread made rye, oats, or whatever was locally available. And in genuine famine, people grind acorns and peas into flour just to have something. England's Acid of Bread and Ale, passed in 1266, legally regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread, specifically to stop bakers from cheating customers. Bread was considered too important and too dangerous to get wrong to leave unregulated. Then the modern era industrialized the whole process. On July 7, 1928, the Chillicothe Baking Company in Missouri sold the first commercially sliced bread using a invented by Otto Frederick Rohwedder after a decade of setbacks, including a fire that destroyed his earlier prototypes. In 1961, researchers in Chorleywood, England developed the Chorleywood bread process, replacing traditional long fermentation with high-speed mechanical mixing, extra yeast, emulsifiers, and dough conditioners. Fast, consistent, cheap, and today responsible for the majority of commercially sold bread across Britain and much of the world. A loaf that once took ancient bakers an entire day of grinding, mixing, and waiting now rolls off production line under 3 hours. So, the real answer. How did humans invent bread? They didn't. Not in one place, not in one moment, not as a single idea. Bread was invented dozens of times independently across thousands of years on nearly every habited continent by people who had never heard of one another, using whatever grain or starchy plant happened to grow nearby. The process always followed the same sequence because the chemistry demanded it. Harvest, grind, hydrate, heat. Wild intune in Jordan, 14,400 years ago. Wild oats in Italy, 32,000 years ago. Corn in Mesoamerica. Teef in Ethiopia. Rice across East Asia. A universal problem met with a convergent solution. Given the geographic separation, the wildly different base grains, and the vastly different timelines involved, the odds of every bread-making culture on Earth learning it from a single common source are essentially zero. What's near certain instead is that any culture with access to starchy seeds or tubibs, grinding tools, water, and fire would eventually arrive at bread on their own. The invention is baked directly into the physics. Here's the part that lingers, though. Bread is just ground seeds, water, and heat. 3 ingredients. That's all it has ever been. And from that simplest possible combination, humans built agriculture, cities, empires, religion, taxation, written language, social hierarchy, political revolution, and eventually the entire global economy. All of it traces back to someone kneeling on the ground with a flat rock, crushing a handful of wild seeds into powder, mixing it with water and pressing onto a hot stone, with no idea whatsoever that they were quietly inventing civilization. They were just trying to eat. Tomorrow morning, you'll probably eat bread. Toast, maybe? A sandwich at lunch. Flatbread with dinner. You won't think about the 14,000-year chain of human effort that put it in your hands. You won't think about the woman whose skeleton stills the physical cost of grinding that flour. You won't think about the hunter-gatherer who first realized that a worthless wild seed, ground fine enough and cooked hot enough, could keep a family alive through winter. You'll just eat it. And honestly, that might be the most human thing about bread of all. It's so fundamental, so woven into everything we are, that we've simply forgotten it was ever invented in the first place.